this video, I'm going to talk about everyone's favorite subject to argue about these days, and that is immigration. Now you might be wondering, why am I seeing a video on immigration on what's supposed to be a technology channel focused on Linux? Well, I used to teach Linux commands to immigrants. For a couple of years, I was a part-time professor at a local college called Conestoga College. Conestoga College has been in the news quite a bit lately, mainly for experiencing a notable increase in their number of international students, as well as for a number of other interesting and noteworthy news items. A few of the courses that I taught were for domestic students, but the vast majority of students that I taught there were international students. I taught courses there in subjects related to embedded systems, operating system development, algorithms and data structures, web development, and network communication. Now, immigration can be a divisive topic, and most intelligent people are smart enough to keep their mouths shut and refrain from participating in the dumpster fire that is online discussions about immigration. This is especially true for most regular people who have a fear of getting cancelled. But fortunately, I'm not a regular person, so I don't have to worry about that. It's very easy these days to find fiery political rants that talk about immigration in a very general sense. But I don't think I've ever seen anyone discuss immigration in a way that matches my own opinions and experiences on the subject. I've actually spent a lot of time in the same room as many of the people that we're bringing into this country. I've spent hundreds of hours marking their tests, grading their assignments, and interacting with them during lab demos. I've talked with some of them about their personal struggles and life ambitions. So hopefully in this video, I can provide some of the much needed nuance that the average unscripted YouTube rant usually misses. So to start off the discussion, I'll start by reviewing a number of common and overly vague statements that I regularly see people making, and provide what I think is the much needed nuance. The first one that I often see is the frequent use of the word Indians. From my experience in teaching at Conestoga College, the country of origin for most international students was in fact from India. And for this reason, members of the public often generalize all students there as Indians. However, many of the people that they're referring to are actually from other countries, like Pakistan, Nepal, Bangladesh, and many others. There were also a few international students from other countries at the college, like Brazil, Ukraine, South Korea, and Nigeria. Now, India turns out to be a fairly big place. The socioeconomic and cultural backgrounds of people from different parts of India varies a lot more than you probably think it does. One day during class, I saw a student playing with a large knife in class. After noticing the knife, I walked over to him and said, "That's a pretty cool knife you've got there." And he explained that the knife was actually a ceremonial dagger called a kirpan, which is a required component of a religious uniform specified in the Sikh Code of Conduct. And if you were to try and generalize from this experience and say that everyone from India carries a ceremonial dagger with them, you would be incorrect, since this practice is not universal within India. On another day, I came to class to teach, to find that only a handful of students had showed up that day. I asked one of the students why attendance was so low, and they explained to me that most of the students had taken the day off to celebrate Diwali, which is a major festive holiday for many people in India. However, the students also explained to me that not everyone in India celebrates Diwali, which is why they were the only ones who showed up that day. And the substantial differences within India don't stop there. India also has far more language diversity than the US or Canada, with 22 officially recognized languages, and as many as 122 languages if you count those that are less formally recognized. On the other hand, in the United States, English has historically been the primary language used in most official federal government communications. In Canada, our official languages are English and French, and according to Stats Canada, as of 2021, 98.1% of Canadians speak at least one of these two languages. Given that India has so many different languages, many Indians opt to learn Hindi as a common second language. However, only slightly more than half of the overall population of India is able to speak Hindi. And finally, the economic diversity within India is also more extreme than it is in the US or Canada. In Canada, the GDP per capita for each province is relatively similar, with the highest GDP province being a little bit more than twice that of the lowest one. And the figures for GDP per capita by each US state, excluding the District of Columbia, shows a similar pattern to that of Canada. However, for India, a similar comparison of GDP per capita in each state shows a tenfold difference between the highest and lowest figures. Unsurprisingly, these substantial differences made an appearance in the classroom as well, Some of the courses at the college supposedly required that the students had already obtained an undergraduate degree in a related technical field. A few of the students came from very poor communities in India, and they described their education as little more than rote memorization. According to them, this came in the form of repeatedly copying from a handwritten book of lecture notes that was supposedly written by a member of the local community who had attended a more prestigious university. On the other hand, like I just said, not everywhere in India is the same. Some students did have a much more formal education from a university that would be much more comparable to Western standards. So you can't necessarily generalize everyone from India based on a single experience. Whenever I had a student that I thought was particularly impressive, I would usually ask them for a copy of the resume. I went back just now and took a look at a couple of these resumes at random to see where these students were educated in India. The two that I picked were from University of Visvesvaraya College of Engineering in Bangalore, India, and Punjab Technical University in Punjab, India. In these cases, I don't quite know whether most of the credit for good academics should go to the student or the university, but the point that I want to get across here is that you can find exceptional people everywhere if you're willing to look for them. In preparing for this video, I did a bit more research to try and figure out which universities in India have a reputation for being the best. But frankly, there are just too many of them, and I have no idea where to find a trustworthy source of information on this topic. Ranking universities in India is completely outside my field of expertise, so maybe someone listening out there can make a detailed video on this topic, so prospective employers know which Indian universities they should be hiring from. I do know that Bangalore is known for having a well-developed tech sector, and a quick image search for Bangalore housing shows a lot of very respectable-looking places to live. These images are likely very different from the mental image that most Westerners have when they think about housing in India. And if you do a search for Silicon Valley of India, you'll find a number of references to the city of Bangalore. The city of Bangalore is also commonly referred to by its native name, Bengaluru, which you may find confusing if you try to do research on this place. Now, obviously, I'm not an expert on India. These are just a few of the things that I learned after a couple of years of working with these students. But hopefully, I've enlightened you a bit about how much you can miss out on if you simply lump everyone in India together. If you were to make generalizations that lump together the people of California with the people of Texas, or the people of Quebec with the people of Alberta, many people would probably call you out on this and criticize your generalizations as inaccurate. India is a very big place, and some people in India are not a huge fan of other groups of people from India. Therefore, since the diversity within India is even greater than it is domestically here in the US or Canada, any broad sweeping generalizations that you make about so-called Indians are not likely to be accurate. Instead, I'd encourage you to do your own research and evaluate people based on their own individual merits and behaviors. Now, you also may have heard some people criticize the academic performance of some of the students from these colleges, saying things like, "These students barely know how to use a computer." I definitely did meet students that fit this description, but I also had students that were on the complete opposite end of the spectrum. In fact, while I was teaching at the college, I saw a much more extreme variation in ability compared to what I saw when I was an undergraduate student studying at the University of Waterloo. If I was to compare the academic abilities of the students that I taught at Conestoga College against my peers from the University of Waterloo, I would say that the average ability of students at Conestoga College was definitely much lower, but the distribution was also much wider. The best students at Conestoga College were much more advanced, but the lowest performing students were much lower. On the lower end, I encountered students at Conestoga who didn't seem to have a basic understanding of how to navigate a file system. I found this quite surprising, since for this particular course, these students, supposedly, had already obtained an undergraduate degree in a related engineering field in their country of origin. Clearly, whatever credentials these students supposedly have obtained in their country of origin need to be taken with a grain of salt. On the opposite end of the spectrum, I had students who were so advanced they practically could have taught the course themselves. I know that this is true because one of my students was formerly a computer science professor in his home country. He was about 10 years older than me and had already published several books on assembly language programming. In contrast, when I was a student at the University of Waterloo, all of my classmates started with some basic programming ability. Many of them were high achievers fresh out of high school, but pretty much everyone was around the same age, with a similar educational background and a similar lack of professional work experience. The next general statement that I see people making is, these students don't speak any English. And to this I say, it depends. I have met students that approximately fit this description, but I've also met the complete opposite. The period that I was teaching at Conestoga College was from 2015 till the start of 2018. Back when I taught there, the minimum level of English language comprehension that I saw was just enough for the student to get through the course material. On the lower end, to give some specific examples of particularly poor written submissions that I saw, here are a couple examples of verbatim responses that students submitted on one of my exams for a course on data structures and algorithms. The exam question was, in your own words, describe what a memory leak is. One student responded, memory leak is happen when more data are stored and at that time application get crashed. We can make it accurate correct while make some small changes in our application. Another student responded, memory leak in a program is when the loop does not stop and there is no close brace at the end of the program. That is called memory leak. Now, as I mentioned before, I also saw the opposite extreme. Some international students had near perfect English and a barely perceptible accent. Having said this, my anecdotal experience is that the minimum standards for English language proficiency here in Canada have been trending down sharply in the last few years. In recent years, I've seen an increasing number of discussions that highlight poor English language proficiency as a barrier when interviewing Conestoga College students for jobs. And even just in walking around here in Kitchener, Ontario, I've noticed a significant increase in the number of bizarre interactions that I have with people who don't seem to speak English very well. One day on my way to the grocery store, I was stopped by a middle-aged man who was not very fluent in English. He asked me how to get to the office of an accountant that he specified by name. I stopped and pulled out my phone to look up the name of this accountant, to which I found no results. I asked them if they had an address for this accountant, and they replied with the street name, but it didn't match any streets that were nearby. I asked this person where they found the contact information for this accountant, and they said that they saw it on a piece of paper somewhere, but didn't take a copy or write it down. I spent about 5 minutes on my phone trying to search for this accountant to give this person some directions, but in the end, I just had to say, I'm not sure, and move on with my day. The person also seemed a little bit confused, and after the interaction was over, I started to wonder about their well-being a bit, because they just seemed to wander off aimlessly. In addition to these extremely labored requests for directions, I've also had a few lost-looking strangers ask to borrow my phone so they can message someone on WhatsApp. When I was an undergraduate student at the University of Waterloo, we had the famous LP exam, the English Language Proficiency Exam, which existed to enforce a minimum proficiency level in the English language. Sometime after I graduated, this English proficiency exam was removed. So as a general rule, it does seem like we've been lowering the bar on English language requirements in Canada for some time now. I actually don't know much about what Canada's standards are with regards to English language comprehension and immigration, but presumably our government has been careful to maintain the minimum language standards necessary to make sure that immigrants here in Canada can be successful and be able to perform tasks like interacting with 911 or other emergency services, reading traffic signs, court notices, or other emergency notifications, and maintaining job mobility so that they don't get trapped with a single employer. The next general statement that people make is that these colleges are all just degree mills. Now, if you were to ask the colleges about this, I'm sure that they'd tell you that they do in fact have a sincere desire to provide the students with a good quality education. Now, from my experience in teaching at one of these colleges, specifically Conestoga College, I would say that they're not lying about their intentions. But intentions and results are two different things. In my opinion, there are two primary root causes that lead to the perception of these colleges as degree mills. The first issue is that the admissions process does not adequately filter out students who are unqualified to be admitted to the program in the first place. And the second is that as professors, we were consistently asked to do more with less, to a degree that at times became absurd. With respect to the inadequate admissions filtering, if you spent some time working with these students, you could be forgiven for suggesting that there must have been no admissions filtering at all. Having said that, I should also acknowledge that even if you did want to filter out these students based on their academic background, this could be borderline impossible, given the lack of verifiable information about a given international student's background. As I mentioned before, some of the students were educated by simply copying an old notebook from their uncle, which granted them a piece of paper from a generic technical institute in India, whereas some students had a much more formal university education. But the problem here is, how do you tell the difference between the good schools in India and the bad ones? And even worse than this, what if someone relies on forged credentials or a fake identity entirely? There were a few cases where we suspected that a student may have forged their past credentials due to implausibly poor academic performance. But as professors, we had no way to prove this, and no specific evidence to point to, so what could even be done about it? In fact, I personally never had any visibility into how the identity or credentials of students was verified at all. In practice, I would imagine that it would be incredibly difficult to make such a system foolproof. Even if you do figure out a system for validating the credentials from India, you now have to do the same thing for every other country in the world that the college accepts admissions from. Can you imagine how difficult it would be to remotely verify the identification and credentials of thousands of students from all kinds of developing countries around the world? I think what probably happens in practice is that very little filtering is done at all. In fact, the first term that I taught at the college, one of the labs that I taught was originally only expected to have around 30 students. And the reason that they even needed to hire me in the first place was because this year, the lab unexpectedly consisted of 68 students and had to be split into 3 different sections. At the time, someone described the college admissions process to me as though they simply approved everyone and completely relied on whoever approves the study permits to actually limit the number of students. And furthermore, they said that this year, for some unknown reason, the study permits had all been unexpectedly approved, leading to the surprisingly high number of students. Now, having said this, I can't 100% confirm this information. This is just what I recall someone telling me at the time, and I have no idea where they got that information or how trustworthy it is. Either way, this issue with inadequate admissions filtering definitely does exist, and it has a knock-on effect that affects the delivery of the course material. When teaching a given course, we were provided with a course syllabus that describes the learning outcomes that students in the course were expected to achieve. The course syllabus would also specify certain prerequisites that the students were expected to already know before being admitted to the course. Frequently, a majority of the students would come into the course having a total lack of the prerequisites, and the lecturers would have to fall back on teaching them things that they were already supposed to know. This is something that I can't really blame the students for, and I would instead put the blame on the system that admitted them into this situation in the first place. If a lack of prerequisites was only a problem for 1 or 2 students, you could just let them fail. But when it's nearly the entire class, you have to do something different. For a number of the courses that I taught, if I were to have graded them based on an aggressive interpretation of the specific course outcomes, literally everyone would have failed, with the exception of maybe 1 or 2 students who probably would have gotten a 90. These students were usually much older and already familiar with the course material. Therefore, in order to do something productive and not just fail everyone, they'd have to be graded on a curve, and the course material would have to be adapted on the fly to match their level of understanding. Effectively, we'd say, okay, the students are struggling. How can we water this down just a little bit more so that the students have an achievable goal that they can work toward? But at the same time, we can also say that the learning outcomes specified in the course syllabus have been satisfied. For example, a course on operating systems might include a learning objective such as demonstrate an ability to implement interprocess communication. For the courses that I took in university, this would mean implementing interprocess communication from scratch. However, if the students can't manage to do this, you could maybe give them 50% of the code and ask them to write the rest by themselves. If they can't do that, you could maybe give them 90% of the code and ask them to fill in the missing bits. If they can't do that, you could just borderline give them the entire solution in lectures, and then give them nearly complete code that's only missing a few values or variables. If they can't do that, you could just give them a multiple choice quiz that asks them questions about how they would hypothetically write the code. At some point, the watering down of the course material starts to get quite absurd, but when the students lack the prerequisites, there is simply no other option other than to let everyone fail and have a 100% dropout rate from the program. But this lack of prerequisite knowledge is just one of the issues that waters down the course content. Often, the course outline was simply too optimistic for the time available to begin with, and many other small factors often compound to make the learning expectations borderline absurd. To give you an example, a class schedule that was typical when I was an undergraduate student was to have a 1-hour class on Monday, Wednesday, and Fridays. However, at the college, a schedule like this could sometimes require that a part-time professor travel all the way into the college only to teach for 1 hour before returning home. As a part-time professor, I didn't have an office at the college. My teaching contract only paid me for the time that I spent standing in front of the students lecturing. So after lectures were over, the only thing for me to do was to return home, using the same overcrowded public transit that the students use. For this reason, and to avoid other scheduling conflicts, the 3 1-hour lecture slots were often combined into 1 3-hour lecture block, scheduled once per week. Sometimes, my schedule was able to involve teaching several 1-hour courses on the same day, but this wasn't always possible, and the final schedule was ultimately dictated by constraints imposed by the college. On paper, swapping 3 1-hour lectures for 1 3-hour lecture is the same thing, but in practice it's not. The most obvious disadvantage is that lecturing for 3 straight hours gets tiring for both the professor and the students. You also lose out on the spaced repetition that you would have gotten from more frequent reminders of the material. But there's also another bigger disadvantage that you might not think about at first, and that is holidays. For one of the courses that I taught, this course was always scheduled on a Monday, and it just so happened that the first time I taught this course, there were 2 holidays during the term that occurred on Mondays. At the time, I thought, well, that's an interesting coincidence, but after teaching the course a few times in a row, it occurred to me that I had never once had a term where we didn't miss at least 1 week due to holidays. Overall, the stated amount of teaching time for the classes that I taught was 15 weeks. But let's do a bit of math. When I was a student in university, our final exams and midterms were scheduled outside of lecture time, so we did have the entire 15 weeks of lectures to start with. But at Conestoga College, the exams were scheduled during lecture time, so 15 weeks minus 1 for the midterm and 1 for the final exam gives you 13 weeks. That's not too bad, but remember, for one of my courses, I said that we lost 2 classes due to holidays. So that brings the total number of lecture classes down to 11, which is already a 27% decrease from the stated time of 15 weeks. That's still a decent number of classes to teach something, but at this point, any additional missed time starts to have an outsized impact. For example, one semester, on the first day that I showed up to teach, the projector wouldn't work, and the college's tech support line was overwhelmed and wasn't able to help. I was able to just do the lecture on the whiteboard, but it wasn't quite what I had planned for, and it wasted a lot of time getting started. Here in Canada, we also have these things called snow days, where the weather is so terrible that no one can go anywhere or do anything, so everything shuts down. During one lecture, near the end of the semester, I showed up to teach, and found that not even a single student had showed up to class. Later on, I learned that this program had an unwritten tradition of not having the lecture before final exams, to give students an additional opportunity to study. But clearly, I hadn't yet been filled in on this tradition. On the last term that I taught at the college, a strike happened, which lasted 5 weeks and a Monday. Since I don't belong to any unions, I just showed up to teach anyway the day that the strike was announced. But I found that all of the doors of the college were locked, so I just went home. Now for this particular term, I already had one of these courses that only had 11 lectures scheduled to start with because of holidays. Doing the math on the 5 weeks and additional Monday lost due to the strike leaves you with a total of 5 lecture classes in the term. After the strike had ended, the term was extended by a couple of weeks, but this wasn't quite enough to make up for the shortfall. In between those 2 additional weeks was also the Christmas holiday, so everyone had just enough time off to forget everything before returning 1 week before final exams. Predictably, after the strike, the college provided direction to the faculty members to come up with an adjusted plan to make the best of the available time that was left during the term, which of course meant watering down the course content even more. When you have less time to cover the same material, there is no other option, and this is where the watering down of the course content starts to become a bit absurd. If you want to make a soup, it's not uncommon to add a little bit of water. And if you need to make a soup for a slightly larger number of people, you can just water down the soup, and probably no one will notice. But at some point, if you water down the soup a little bit too much, people are going to start to notice. Ironically, in this particular course, No one, except for my 2 top students, showed up to the next lecture after the strike had ended. I asked these 2 students where everyone was, and they explained that everyone had chosen to skip my class in order to study for an extremely urgent deadline in another course. If I recall correctly, it was an exam that was scheduled to take place in another course immediately after my lecture. Since the students and faculty were trying to handle an accelerated timeline for all of their courses at once, this made for an incredibly chaotic end of the term. It shouldn't come as a surprise that a teaching environment like this can experience a high level of turnover among part-time teaching staff. And whenever a new professor starts teaching a course, there is inevitably a ramp-up period before the professor figures out what they're doing. When you teach a course for the first time, you'll come in with lots of expectations about the class that turn out to not be true. The biggest one, of course, is finding out that most of the students lack the prerequisites that the course is based upon. When taking over a course for the first time, it was customary to obtain access to a previous professor's online course shell, where you could find things like previous lecture slides, assignments, or grading schemes that were used during previous iterations of the course offering. For at least one of the courses that I taught, this was essential, since I only found out that I'd be teaching the course a couple weeks in advance, and I wouldn't have had enough time to prepare my own lecture slides and assignments in advance. One of the first courses that I taught at the college was a course on operating systems, and the course outline called for something like 6 assignments. But when I gained access to the previous professor's online course shell, I only saw 4 assignments, and the specification for the last assignment didn't look complete. I had been in communication via email with this previous professor, and while they did respond to my first email of questions, they didn't respond to my subsequent emails asking about the missing assignments. After I started teaching the course and saw what the students were capable of, I understood that what probably happened was the previous professor started off with their very reasonable but ambitious assignments and quickly found out that the students weren't able to complete them and had to make adjustments to the course material on the fly, which led to the last 2 assignments being dropped. Contractually speaking, you're supposed to teach what's in the course syllabus, and faculty members generally place a substantial focus on trying to honor those requirements. But as I said before, the day-to-day assignments and tests have to be realistic. Otherwise, literally everyone would fail. And even if you did grade them extra harshly, you'll now find yourself battling a new problem, and that is plagiarism. When a class full of students feels that they have no hope of survival by following the rules, the solution becomes simple: stop following the rules. Plagiarism and cheating is, of course, always a problem that colleges and universities have had to deal with. But the problem becomes much more prevalent when the curriculum is too aggressive. In my observations, once you reach a certain critical mass of students who try to engage in plagiarism, you'll basically just end up with everyone in the class trying to plagiarize. If you think back to the psychology of when you were a student, it's not hard to imagine how this could happen. Marking tests and assignments is a lot of work, but checking for, and more importantly, proving plagiarism is even more work. And if the professor starts slacking off or doesn't have time to check, cheating will go unpunished and possibly even undetected. If 1 or 2 students try to engage in plagiarism, I think it's fair to put the blame on the students. But when the entire class feels that the only way to pass the course is to engage in plagiarism, I think that the professor, or the course outline itself, deserves a bit of the blame as well. Now, returning to the question of whether these colleges are degree mills or not, it's also useful to say a bit about the professors who work there. My experiences at the college reinforced what I already believed to be true about teachers in general, and that is that there are 2 primary categories of people that go into teaching. The first category is people who care so much about the students and the subject matter that they're teaching that they're willing to endure less pay than they'd make otherwise, so that they can share their knowledge with the world and inspire the next generation. And the second category is people who simply aren't able to get a better job elsewhere. Some of you will probably claim that professors are entitled and overpaid. I'm sure that you can find some examples of professors who match this description, but many professors work in low-status part-time positions that completely lack any form of job security. And for most technical fields like engineering, qualified people can usually make more money just by working in industry. In terms of the other professors that I worked with, there is at least one that I can think of who is exceptionally talented, and I'm extremely confident that the students in his courses really did learn very useful engineering skills. He also taught the same cohort of students multiple courses at once, and was able to tie together the material of multiple courses in a way that was extremely cohesive and time efficient. This seemingly subtle detail actually made a huge difference, given the tight timelines for delivering the course material. And by the time I started teaching there, he already had a lot of practice in teaching his courses. Most of the professors that I worked with directly were very actively engaged in trying to make the students successful. For one of the programs that I taught in, we had regular faculty meetings that were effectively done on our own personal time, where we discussed how to help the students and the issues that we faced in delivering the course material successfully. On the other hand, I was also aware of the opposite extreme. There were a few other professors who I didn't see very often, who I would describe as checked out. They seemed to have the minimum amount of passion necessary to maintain their employment, and not much more than that. I occasionally heard murmurs from students, and sometimes other professors, about their dissatisfaction with these professors. During my time at the college, I also became aware of several professors who probably shouldn't have been teaching at all. The first time that you teach a course, it's not uncommon to be not very good at it. In some cases, these professors improved their teaching methods, and in other cases, the college chose not to renew their contracts. And of course, I also taught there. So for better or for worse, whether you think I'd make a good or bad professor, I'm literally one example of someone who taught there for a couple of years. Now, what can be said about the behavior and work ethic of the students at the college? Well, it really depends. I had some students with incredible work ethic and 10 years of relevant work experience. And on the other hand, I also had some students that weren't particularly great as well. One example that stands out in my mind is a couple of students who were in a group together for one of my labs. For the first couple months of the term, I never saw these students show up to labs even once, and I had assumed that they had simply dropped the course or been unable to secure their study visas in the first place. Near the end of the term, both of these students came to me in a panic and confirmed that they were in fact enrolled in the course. They said that this experience, studying here in Canada, was the first time in their lives without adult supervision, and they had taken this opportunity to visit local bars and spend all day drinking and socializing. And as a result, they hadn't completed any of the lab assignments. They seemed to be very apologetic with me about their drinking habits, and pleaded with me to forgive them for this behavior. But I explained to them that I only cared about whether they could actually complete the lab assignments or not, and the ability to balance rigorous academic work with a rigorous partying lifestyle is actually more impressive and not less. On the last day before the end of lab demos, these two partners decided to pull an all-nighter to try and complete all of the lab assignments in a single sitting. One of the partners apparently got tired and went home to sleep before I came around to see their lab demos, and the remaining partner was still there working when class started the next morning. Unfortunately, though, their lab demo was basically incoherent, and both students ended up repeating the course. And unsurprisingly, I had many other categories of students who definitely weren't star performers. I had some students who were extremely condescending, some who would steal work done by other students and submit it as their own, or students who would submit requests for alternate examination with questionable justification. Often, in the first few days of the class, I'd get an idea of which students were likely to be star performers, and which ones would barely be able to pass the class. However, this initial impression didn't always predict the final outcome for the student. It wasn't rare for me to see a fairly advanced student, who was usually much older and much more experienced with the course material, get a perfect mark on the first assignment, but then start to get arrogant, skip classes, and stop handing in assignments. Sometimes, they'd finish the course with only a mediocre grade, even though I know that they could do better if they would just hand in their assignments. I also saw some students who were usually much younger and much less experienced, who would initially seem hopelessly lost with a total lack of understanding for any of the course prerequisites. Every once in a while, one of these seemingly weak students would miraculously forge their way through the course material and produce completely original work, and demonstrate a satisfactory understanding during lab demos. In my view, these miracle turnaround cases are much more impressive than the older students who come in already knowing the course material. Even though these students don't graduate at the top of the class, these are the ones who started at a disadvantage. If you extrapolate the behavior of a student like this out into the future, you'll eventually end up with an extremely capable individual. I think it's worth emphasizing that you can't figure out who these people are just from one conversation. It takes at least a whole term to identify someone like this, who has good work ethic and the initiative to solve their own problems. So, to summarize the quality of students that I saw, some of the students were 30-something-year-old professionals with lots of relevant work experience in their field, and others were teenagers who barely knew how to use a computer and had no issues with lying or cheating. A few of them were exceptionally talented and hardworking people with high integrity, but the other 95% of them were somewhere in between these extremes, with a mediocre and unremarkable work ethic. It turns out that every individual human being is different, and can't be treated like an interchangeable piece of inventory that's sitting in a warehouse somewhere, which is not the impression that you'd get if you read any of the documentation that our government produces about how they process immigration applications. The last generalization that I want to talk about is when people say that the international students here are doing just great, and that some of them are even bragging. The primary stated reason that most international students come here is in pursuit of a better life and higher living standards. And if you do a quick Google search to see how much a software engineer in India makes compared with the USA or Canada, the figures that you see make for a pretty convincing argument for why so many people would want to come here. But under the surface, things are a bit more complicated. For starters, the role of a software engineer in India may not necessarily translate to the same role here in North America, and many students here are surprised at just how competitive the job market is for these lucrative roles. And having personally educated some of these students and marked their assignments, I can vouch for the fact that it's not uncommon for some of the incredibly bright students to end up in roles that I personally believe are below their true potential. Just because a job has the word tech or software in it doesn't necessarily mean that it pays well or leads to long-term growth prospects. And when you consider tuition costs, housing issues, and other living expenses, I think it's worth asking, maybe these students are suffering a bit more than they're comfortable admitting. After having spent a lot of time with many of these students, I can tell you that there are significant cultural differences in how students from India communicate that are likely to impact our ability to understand how well they're doing. When I posted my 37-year-old broke loser video, many people, including those from Western audiences, can understand how a lot of people would have reservations about posting a similar video. Posting a video like this that can be seen by millions of people is something that could cause you to lose face or potentially harm your future career prospects, so it's not something that's high on everyone's priority list. It's not surprising that most people are self-conscious and don't want to lose face, but the potentially surprising thing that you may not realize is that most of these international students from India are much more self-conscious about losing face than Western students are. In the courses that I taught to domestic students, most of them had no trouble in challenging the assertions that I was making in the course material. Some of them would even get surprisingly defensive in making totally wrong assertions about basic facts of the course material that I was presenting. And generally speaking, I do consider this to be a healthy part of the educational process, because it demonstrates that the students are thinking for themselves. In contrast, for my international students, they were much less inclined to indicate any lack of understanding of the course material, and it was rare for them to engage in any form of protracted questioning that could be seen as disobedient. In fact, most international students would use overly formal language when addressing me, calling me sir or professor, while most domestic students generally never did this. Communication differences like these ones can be significant, and have even been formally recognized in the context of aviation safety, where the cultural differences in how authority figures are treated have contributed to several high-profile aviation disasters. This excessive respectfulness was effective in boosting my ego, but it was often an impairment to the educational process. When discussing the course material with international students, they would more frequently prefer to say nothing at all, or simply agree with whatever I was saying, even when they didn't understand anything at all. Some students would do anything to avoid losing face, and potentially being seen as not knowing the answer. And from what I've observed, this unwillingness to lose face in an academic context also extends to their personal lives. If you told your mother that you were moving to a different country to pursue a luxurious new life in the promised land, Would you have the heart to tell her that actually things didn't pan out so well? Maybe you'd just try to make the best of it and suffer in silence to avoid the embarrassment that things didn't work out like you told everyone that they would. And when you ponder this topic, I think it's important to not only focus on the struggles of young men in these international programs, but also the unique struggles of young women. According to our beloved former Prime Minister, Canada is a country where men should be able to declare that they're feminists. But even though Canada is a nation of proud male feminists, I don't see a lot being said about the unique struggles faced by female international students. Finding housing in this country is bad enough if you're a man, but imagine being a young woman alone in a foreign country, and the only housing options available to you are basement apartments where you have to sleep next to strangers. Many women who grew up here in Canada have lots of experience in speaking up for their rights. However, the women from these international programs generally have less experience in this activity due to certain cultural differences. And given what I've just explained to you about how the young men from these international programs are more likely to suffer in silence, you can only imagine what kind of silent suffering goes on among the young women from these international programs as well. Now, before we can have a serious discussion about immigration, it's important to highlight something that I don't see emphasized enough, and that is that the on-the-ground reality of immigration in Canada depends very much on where you are. The recent wave of immigration in Canada has been so dramatic and so fast that you might not even believe what people in another province or city are telling you, because your experience is totally different. The first point to drive home is that the concentration of where immigrants go seems to be very extreme, so much so that I doubt any single person can give you an accurate description of how immigration has changed Canada in the last decade. In many rural areas, I wouldn't be surprised if most of the population is still elderly people of European descent, and if you ask them about significant immigration, they might not even know what you were talking about. On the other hand, when I was a student in university, the majority of the student population was first or second generation immigrants from China. But when I was teaching at the college, there were almost no students from China, and the vast majority of students had recently arrived from India. Not too far from where I am, in the nearby municipality of Brampton, one source describes the demographics as being 80.6% composed of minorities. I've never been to Brampton, so I can't confirm this statistic, but I can provide a reference to another YouTuber who actually visited Brampton and estimates that the number may be even higher. The second point that's worth discussing is the extreme variability in the degree to which different groups of immigrants are already familiar with Canadian language and culture. Back when I was an undergraduate student in university, I didn't experience many cultural barriers, since most of my classmates were already very familiar with Canadian language and culture, even though the class was ethnically diverse. However, when I first started teaching at the college, I initially had some difficulty in understanding their accents, and sometimes I couldn't quite understand what the students were saying. Over time, I became used to it, and eventually, I was barely able to perceive their accents at all, but this took at least a few semesters. I also learned a number of different nuances in how they communicate that were initially a source of confusion for me. For example, a common interaction with students from India was for them to raise their hand and say, "I have a doubt." To most English-speaking audiences, making a statement like this during a lecture would usually mean that they have a doubt about the accuracy of something that was being presented in the lecture material. Over time, I came to understand that this statement should probably be replaced with, "I have a question," or "I'm confused about something." Another subtle point of confusion was the pronunciation similarity between the words register and resistor. Since we were teaching courses on embedded systems programming, the terms register and resistor came up frequently in conversation, and students would frequently substitute one word with the other by mistake, due to their pronunciation similarity. In the context of embedded systems programming, substituting one of these words with the other would often produce another valid sentence, but with a completely different meaning. So this was something we had to be aware of. These are just a few examples of the kinds of nuances that you need to pick up on to communicate effectively with other cultures. For the majority of the last decade, most of the interactions that I've had with other cultures have been those from India and China. Although, in the last year or so, I've started to meet a number of new people here in the Kitchener area, from countries in northern Africa, in particular from Eritrea. Eritrea is a country that I hadn't heard much about until recently, so I've been watching documentaries to try and understand its history and culture. Eritrea is a small coastal country in the Horn of Africa. It shares a border with Sudan, Ethiopia, and Djibouti. In the late 1800s, Eritrea was a colony of Italy, and many of the architectural influences of Italy can still be seen there to this day. The telecommunications infrastructure in Eritrea is kept under tight control of their government, and access to foreign media is quite limited. Historically, Eritrea was administered by Ethiopia for a period of time until it gained independence in 1961. Since then, many regional tensions exist within Eritrea and its neighboring countries. So, that's enough discussion about my worldly experiences, but what do I really think about immigration? For most of my life, up until around a few years ago, I never really thought about immigration at all. If you had questioned me for my opinions on immigration growing up, I probably would have said that most of the immigrants I'd met were highly skilled professionals, because that was my lived experience. And as I understand, historically, that's exactly what Canada's immigration system used to have a reputation for. Although, in the last few years, things have changed a bit, and so have my opinions. The primary opinion that I have now is that the government really needs to get its story straight about exactly why they're facilitating such a historic increase in all forms of immigration. So far, the explanations that I've heard are a bit confusing to me. One of the stated reasons for the recent surge of immigration is that Canada has a large aging population. Since young people are having fewer children these days, the goal of increased immigration is to maintain the relative size of the working age population. This argument makes sense, because without workers, you won't have anyone to pay the taxes that fund social services like pensions or infrastructure. As a result, the government has decided to make up for this shortfall by welcoming on the order of 500,000 new people per year through immigration. According to the media, many people have recently just decided to stop having children out of personal preference. But I've always thought it seems a bit strange that human beings have existed on Earth for around 300,000 years, but suddenly, just in my brief lifetime, everyone decided to stop having children. I've wondered if it maybe has less to do with personal choice, and more to do with the bleak economic reality that makes household formation nearly impossible. The media seems to have made up its mind that the root cause is mostly down to personal choice. But if the government had come to me and said, "Robert, we need you to have 500,000 children per year to make up for the population shortfall," I would have said, "No problem." But the government never asked me. I even looked for an option to specify this on my tax returns, but I couldn't find one. Back when I was growing up in school, long before climate change was the primary environmental concern, I was taught that overpopulation was the most significant problem that the world faced, and that one of the worst things that you could do in life was to have children before you were much older and more financially stable. Since I want to be a good person and do the right thing, I internalized this idea and incorporated it into my life plan. The other confusing part of this argument about using immigration to support the aging population is our government's surprising decision to temporarily create an immigration pathway to support immigration of people's grandparents. If we allow people's grandparents to immigrate, won't that lead to more of the same problem that we're trying to solve? And the final concern I have is this: what if the often repeated phrase that people decided not to have children isn't a voluntary decision after all? What if the decrease in fertility rate really does have something to do with the way that society is being run? If the government can't figure out how to run a sustainable economy with its existing population, why should we believe that they're qualified to care for an entirely new population? If the economic math didn't work for the current generation, why is it going to suddenly start working for the next generation? Won't we just have the exact same problem again in another generation or two, even with immigration? Is anyone even thinking about this problem? What if it turns out that the government is effectively just running a giant Ponzi scheme, with people instead of money? The second common narrative of immigration is that we're bringing everyone here because we want to help them. Aren't we Canadians such nice people? We deserve a pat on the back, don't we? But if we're so good at caring for people who are in need, why do we have refugees who end up sleeping on the streets or spending time in the shelter system? Why do some of the Ukrainian refugees who come here choose to return to an active war zone because they can't find any housing here? Why do we have basement apartments where up to 25 students have to live together? Why do we see stories of funeral homes expressing concern for the mental health of international students? And why do we see reports like this one from the United Nations that characterize Canada's temporary foreign worker program as a breeding ground for contemporary forms of slavery? It almost seems like we're not trying very hard to help these people. It kind of seems like we're trying to take advantage of them. Otherwise, why would we have situations where students end up living in tents beside the freeway, or losing all of their money to fraudulent student rental scams, or cases like the Syrian refugees who were shepherded by our government into housing infested by bedbugs, only to then be sued by their landlord, Michael Klein, for the rental arrears that resulted from having to leave the property early due to their grievances with the living conditions. And yes, if you're wondering, that is in fact the very same Michael Klein that you've heard about in my other videos, who is currently trying to rent-evict me, as well as 61 other people in this building alone, and hundreds of other people across Ontario. Many of the refugees who came here did so with the goal of escaping conflicts in their home country. But somehow, we've also let them down by allowing some of these conflicts to follow them here, which seems like it would undermine the oasis of stability that these people were seeking here in the first place. Don't we have a duty to protect these people from the chaos that they were trying to escape? When confronted with stories like these, I often hear people try to justify these outcomes, saying things like, even though it's not great, it's still better than where they come from, isn't it? But this can be a slippery slope, and a convenient excuse to treat vulnerable people poorly. If we keep lowering the bar on how we're willing to treat people who are in need, we could be sleepwalking into a very dark place. So, how can we make the immigration system better? One of the main insights that I can provide is that the filtering system that colleges use for international students needs to be improved significantly. It's not a secret that a lot of the students who come out of Ontario colleges have questionable qualifications, and unfortunately, this damages the reputation of all students, including previous ones who attended those same colleges. It's also not fair to the top-performing students who came here under the promise of a valuable education and an easy time finding employment. From what I've seen in other media reports, it seems like the root of the problem comes from unscrupulous college recruitment programs that conduct aggressive sales and marketing campaigns in order to sign up as many students as possible. According to some anecdotal reports, these immigration recruiters will basically tell prospective students anything that they want to hear in order to sign them up and collect the referral bonus. This issue was explored at length in one documentary shown here, although at this point, it's not clear to me to what extent this problem is actually being addressed. Many of these college recruitment programs operate in foreign countries, where oversight on this kind of conduct is difficult or impossible to police. In an ideal world, I think that the best model would be one where colleges, or possibly even the government, establish some kind of physical foreign presence in the country of origin where most of these students come from. Something that could function like a mini college intake outpost or a basic testing center, where students could have identity and credentials verified in a way that's considered highly trustworthy by the destination country. The burden and cost of this would be placed upon the prospective students themselves. These testing centers wouldn't even need to actually teach anything. It could even just be a few days of in-person examination, or even as little as a 20-minute in-person interview process to assess whether the student would be successful in the destination country. Things like testing for minimum language comprehension and a basic understanding of Canadian law and culture. You could also ask a few simple domain-specific questions to filter out anyone with obviously fraudulent credentials. If the student fails this brief evaluation, they could be given instructions on what to study for, and given the opportunity to apply again in the future. Something like this might even develop into a small industry that could benefit the local economy in the source country. This would also protect the students from having to fly thousands of miles to a new country, only to pay for expensive tuition and flunk out of the program, or be unable to secure the lucrative jobs that they were promised due to unexpectedly poor academic performance. I also think that major improvements could be made on the complete opposite end of the college system, and by that, I mean fostering a closer connection between the demands of the job market and the content that actually gets taught in the classroom. From my perspective, the colleges have almost no feedback loop to the real demands of the economy at all. And this can be a problem if the course outlines aren't actually teaching the skills that will be useful to employers. When I was teaching at the college, this was something that I asked about, and the response I got was that there was some sort of student satisfaction survey for graduates that asked students for feedback on their experiences in entering the job market, but the response rate was apparently incredibly low. Still, I was interested in knowing what the small number of surveys was showing, because I needed this information to inform the way I should be teaching my courses. But apparently, the amount of feedback from these surveys was so low that it wasn't even being kept track of. I actually participated in a few of the meetings at the college where we discussed program reviews and the proposed changes to the curriculum in certain courses. During these meetings, the discussions would always circle back to, what do employers actually want us to be teaching? Should we focus more on C programming, or should we use Python programming? Which protocols and technologies should we consider obsolete? And which new ones should we add coverage for? There's no shortage of things that you could teach, but if the knowledge doesn't produce the most employable students, you're just wasting everyone's time. During these meetings, at least a few of the professors did have some connections to business owners in the area, so they were able to provide a handful of anecdotal stories about what was or wasn't in demand in the job market. But to my knowledge, no comprehensive research or outreach program was conducted to actually talk to a large number of prospective employers. In an ideal world, I think that colleges could significantly improve outcomes for students if there was at least one part-time faculty member per program with ongoing teaching experience in that program whose job it was to do outreach to employers. The faculty member could then use this information to inform curriculum changes, and optionally, to set up potential connections for co-op employment. From what I understand, the colleges generally rely on existing faculty to use their own personal industry experience to inform these decisions. But in my opinion, this just isn't enough. A given faculty member will likely only have experience in a handful of companies, and it's quite likely that some of their historical experience may already be out of date or be too specific to represent the entire job market as a whole. And furthermore, it's also worth noting that new faculty members are a lot less likely to go out of their way to request necessary curriculum changes. Until they're more confident in their teaching, they'll most likely just go along with whatever's in the course syllabus, which is usually just copied and pasted from the last year. This is a particularly important point when faculty turnover is high. This issue with the lack of feedback between the job market and the college programs doesn't stop there. The world is changing rapidly, and the colleges are trying to adjust to this new reality by creating totally new educational programs in response. The result is educational programs where it's not entirely clear yet if jobs will even exist for the graduates of these programs. And in reality, I think that colleges just make up new programs based on what they think that students will enroll in, because ultimately, that's what generates the tuition money. I do think that they want students to be successful and learn useful skills, but the ultimate forcing function for the college is tuition revenue, not the career success of the students. The college is probably thinking to themselves, well, if this degree was actually useless, students wouldn't enroll in it, right? But the students are thinking to themselves, well, if this degree was actually useless, the college wouldn't offer it, right? Hopefully, you can see the issue with this kind of circular reasoning. In an ideal world, colleges would place a significant amount of effort into closing this feedback loop with the actual job market. And some of you are probably thinking that the government should create some kind of system to force them to. That's one idea, but you'd have to think very carefully about how you implemented this. Otherwise, you might accidentally create perverse incentives, like taxpayer-funded make-work projects, or conflicts of interest between the private sector and the colleges. Either way, I think it's actually a little bit too late to even think about this, and the feedback loop is actually being closed right now through social media. This issue of seeing a decreasing return on investment from college degree programs is becoming a much larger societal problem, and a lot of young people are being exposed to more and more testimonials from their older peers who say that college or university isn't worth it. In my opinion, whether it's actually worth it or not depends on which college you go to, who your teachers were, the quality of any co-op programs offered, and the job prospects for the program that you studied in. However, most young people are probably not going to make this distinction, or even do the necessary background research on the program that they're considering. Instead, many young people will simply start broadly dismissing the idea of going to university or college at all. College has had the opportunity to self-police themselves and preserve their reputation in the past, but that ship is starting to sail, and if they don't act fast, they're going to face the consequences. Canadian colleges have been getting a lot more attention in the media lately, so if they want to work on repairing their reputation, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit that they can work on first. The next thing that we could do to improve society for everyone, including and especially immigrants, is to stop turning every discussion about immigration into arguments about racism. Canada has been an extremely ethnically diverse country for a very long time now, and the effects of excessive immigration impact everyone of all races, many of whom are recent immigrants. A common narrative is that the only people with an opinion on immigration are entitled white people. But I can tell you that in this very building, where the landlord is currently trying to rent-evict tenants who are supposed to be protected by rent control, that some of the tenants who are being replaced by immigrants are themselves recently arrived immigrants. I've only had a few brief interactions with some of these people, but I can say that the reason you don't hear many stories of these people's struggles is that many of them don't speak English well and haven't been in our country long enough to really understand how our system works and what legal rights they're supposed to have. A lot of them have young families and come from countries where speaking out in the media can lead to arbitrary imprisonment. So if you're wondering why you never see these people making hour-long YouTube rants criticizing the government, that might have something to do with it. In basically every school and workplace environment that I've occupied in my adult life, I've been a racial minority, so at this point, I've never really known much different. When I first moved up here to Ontario in 2009 to study software engineering, I don't recall anyone talking about immigration at all. I also don't recall meeting anyone who had a negative view of immigration back then. The software engineering class that I graduated from was no more than 40% ethnically white, and I felt very lucky and excited to be among a group of the most intelligent people from around the world. In fact, I never really thought much about the racial distribution of my class until making this video, when I actually went back and took a look at everyone from my original class list. One of the major reasons for this is that everyone in my class back then, regardless of race, spoke extremely good English and had significant cultural and family ties to Canada. When I socialized with my classmates about things like childhood experiences, cultural events, or holidays, there was a lot of mutual understanding about what we were talking about. We need to stop conflating the concept of race with culture and language proficiency. The best way to explain what I'm talking about would be to recount an interaction I once had with a female coworker at lunch. The context of this interaction was that we were both at work, sitting at a lunch table together. We noticed a couple other coworkers who we both knew who were looking for a place to sit. They were scanning the seating area looking for us or anyone else that they knew that they could sit with. At this point, I made a joking suggestion to her, saying that we should remain incredibly still in order to not be noticed by these coworkers, and that their eyes were only sensitive to motion. In my mind, this was just a corny joke that was a reference to the 1993 hit movie Jurassic Park, where the protagonist of the story attempts to hide from a T-Rex by remaining completely motionless. Unfortunately, my joke didn't land well because she had no idea what I was talking about. I tried to explain the movie reference, but she had never heard of the Jurassic Park movie series at all. This particular coworker also didn't have the best English language proficiency, and the more I tried to explain the joke, the more she became confused about what I was trying to say. At one point, she thought that the joke was being made at her expense, and that I was trying to say that she was ugly and had skin like that of a dinosaur. She thought that I was trying to say that her ugly dinosaur-like skin had something to do with why the coworkers didn't want to come sit with us. The problem in this interaction has nothing to do with anyone's race, and everything to do with a lack of shared common history. In fact, it's worth mentioning that when I went through my class list to do a count of the actual demographics, I had to go back and recount a couple times, because I mistakenly counted several people who I knew very well as the same race as me when they actually weren't. It turns out that when you have the opportunity to develop strong social connections with people and go through shared experiences over time, it actually starts to become difficult to even see racial differences at all. In my opinion, this obsession with arguing about racial differences is something that all areas of the political spectrum are guilty of. And to make matters worse, the state of discourse on these issues is becoming increasingly nonsensical. In online political discussions, every topic seems to be framed as left-wing this or right-wing that. But at the same time, a given opinion can frequently be criticized for being both left-wing and right-wing simultaneously. So hopefully, I've been politically ambiguous enough in this video to offend both conservatives and liberals equally, which will lead to lots of engagement and views on this video. Increasingly, more and more people seem to be spending an unhealthy amount of time reading news all day, and the result is that a lot of people, of all political leanings, seem to be suffering from a form of political brain rot. Some of you will say, you can just stand up and walk away from the computer, or go outside and talk to people in real life. And in the last couple years, I've been doing a lot more of that. From talking to more people face to face, I've come to the conclusion that the chronically online political brain rot of the internet is starting to leak out into the real world. Everyone seems to be focusing on whatever political dramas are unfolding in their own echo chamber, and these mini dramas are distracting us from having the more productive arguments that would lead to building a more fair society for everyone. Recently, I've started to see examples in my everyday life where people use accusations of racism to promptly shut down conversations on topics like illegal immigration. I find that concerning because illegal immigration goes hand in hand with human trafficking, which is bad. And to me, it seems irresponsible how certain people are so eager to shut down these kinds of discussions, especially when you consider that being an illegal immigrant doesn't say anything about what race you are. I've also noticed that people are becoming too comfortable having protracted philosophical arguments, using only surface-level facts about a situation. As an example of what I'm talking about, I could tell you that every one of the students that I had at the college, who was from South Korea, was a top performer in the class. Armed with only this fact, many people will happily argue about the root cause of this pattern, using only the information that I provided. Some would ask, could this be evidence that the students from South Korea are receiving some kind of preferential treatment or privilege that needs to be corrected through affirmative action? Or could it be that we are seeing some kind of uncomfortable biological truth about race that we are not supposed to talk about? You can find no shortage of hours-long rambling podcasts arguing either side of topics like these. But I claim that neither of these things is the most important story here, because every one of the students that I taught, who was from South Korea, came into our program with 10 years prior experience as an embedded systems firmware engineer at Samsung Corporation, while in comparison, most of the other students were in their teens or early 20s and had little to no job experience. This might sound like an oddly specific explanation, but it's the truth, and it has nothing to do with anyone's race. So next time that you catch yourself judging someone based on their race, consider instead judging them based on how many years that they've been a software engineer. I think this recent preoccupation with race is a symptom of many other societal problems that we've been facing in the last few years. Oftentimes, when people say offensive things that are racist, it's because they have something else going on in their lives that's stressing them out and making them feel angry. Now, being angry is not an excuse to be offensive, but it certainly explains why some people have this bad behavior. And if you hadn't noticed recently, a lot of people are starting to become angry about not having a place to live. Maybe if we put half as much effort into building more housing as we put into arguing about racism, maybe people would be a bit less angry. And if they weren't so angry, maybe that would also make them less racist. So, to broadly summarize my views on immigration, I think that if someone comes into this country under legal methods, we should treat them with respect and give them the opportunity to achieve the same standard of living as every other citizen. And if you want to have compassion for the immigrants who are coming into this country, you can start by having compassion for the immigrants who are already in this country. If you ask the question, who is hurt most by unfiltered immigration? Do you think that it's someone who looks like me? Or is it the student that I taught who was of Indian descent who had a master's degree from the University of Waterloo from years ago. If you were to look at him, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference between him and the thousands of other Conestoga College students who came directly from India with questionable qualifications. When he goes out into the job market, he's going to struggle to stand out from his less qualified peers, despite the fact that he speaks perfect English, has work experience in Canada, and has a much more highly qualified undergraduate degree. Ideally, it shouldn't be like this, but prospective employers have a limited amount of patience for sorting through thousands of unqualified applicants. I marked this student's labs, so I can say with confidence that he was extremely capable. But I also know that he's at a disadvantage because of the unfavorable reputation of his peers. And that's not because of anything he did wrong or any decisions that he made. You should also remember that we're not just talking about academic credentials here. Every time that you mistakenly let in someone who's on the terror watch list or turn a blind eye to someone who's doing human trafficking, this harms the reputation of other immigrants who are good people and just want to live their lives. And once you've adequately screened people, you need to make sure that you actually have housing for them somewhere. Colleges should really play a more active role in making sure that their students can find housing. If they want to rely on market housing, then they need to start doing their math a bit better. And if not, then maybe they need to take on the burden of housing themselves. According to the media, the increase in immigration was done primarily due to a labor shortage. And even though the government might have had a bit of a heads up on housing issues, the plan was just to bring 1 million people per year into a country that builds 250,000 housing units per year. And when this resulted in the breakdown of society, they pulled a surprised Pikachu face and said, "Oops, I'm sorry about that. I forgive you, but please be a little bit more careful in doing your math next time." It turns out that balancing immigration numbers with housing availability is kind of a big deal. And furthermore, flip-flopping on immigration policy like this causes another big issue that I almost forgot to mention. I can't think of a better way to scare away the best and brightest talent from our country than to tell them to fly thousands of miles to start a new life in an unfamiliar place, and then a few months later tell them that the country's full and that they need to go back home. Smart people are good at finding patterns, and if the pattern in our immigration policy is that we don't keep our word, then the smartest people are going to be the first ones to pick up on that. So if we want to pretend that we're a serious country, we need to make up our minds, figure out what the policy is, and stick to it. The reason that I started this YouTube channel was because I'm very interested in the details of technology, and I want to share this interest with other people, because technology can empower people to have more control over their lives and make them more productive. But daydreaming about the high-tech society of the future is becoming increasingly nonsensical when we can't even figure out the low-tech details of the present. Immigration policy is an incredibly important thing to get right, so I hope that in this video I have given you a useful perspective to inform your opinion on the subject. Irresponsible immigration policy hurts immigrants. You might think you're being a nice person by trying to rescue the entire world, but there's a reason that airplane masks have an instruction to fix your own mask first. And if you're willing to endure a personal sacrifice to support as many immigrants as you can, that's very nice of you. But bear in mind that the sacrifice you're making is not entirely borne by you. It's also borne by the student that I had who used to stay up all night working in a box factory, and always came to class with bloodshot eyes and a perfectly programmed lab demo. Or the group of students who pulled an all-nighter and actually did manage to produce a fantastic lab demo. Or the student who always came to my class 20 minutes early to ask questions about the course material. And I could go on and on. It's this small group of exceptionally hardworking and talented students, who are usually too shy to speak up for themselves, that I think we need to do a better job of supporting. And if I end up taking some heat for this video, it's this group of people that I'm happy to do it for. These are the people that I care about most, regardless of their race, gender, orientation, etc. And when I say that, I don't mean that in the kind of fake virtue signaling way that people often use on social media when they're pretending to be a nice person. I actually do mean it. In my opinion, these are the type of people who I really do think we could let an infinite number of into this country. And even if we did end up with a surplus of hardworking, high-integrity people who didn't have a place to live, maybe we could send them to stay in the spare bedrooms of some of our political leaders so that they could learn a thing or two about integrity, and maybe, just maybe, a little bit about how to run an economy that can actually build housing. So there you have it. Those are my views on immigration. Maybe if we all use our noggins, we could come up with some good immigration policy that makes everyone happy. Something other than ridiculous extremes, like mass deportations, that include law-abiding citizens who have lived here for years, or totally open borders with absolutely no security screening on the other extreme. Whatever we were doing back in the early 2000s, that seemed to be working pretty well. So maybe we could go back and take a look at whatever that was. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit the like button. And if you disagree with something that I said, don't forget to accuse me of being a racist.